They emerged from the tunnel into a ruined courtyard where smoke drifted between collapsed walls and the distant thunder of battle echoed across the sky. Dae-young set Yuna down and checked his surroundings with practiced efficiency, and he spotted the eastern horizon where Terran forces should have established their defensive line. The problem was getting there. Between their position and safety lay several blocks of contested territory where both armies were still fighting for control. And Dae-young knew that taking a child through an active combat zone was almost certainly a death sentence. He contacted Silva through his communication device and asked for an extraction option. And her response was not encouraging. She told him that all available transports were engaged in evacuating wounded personnel, and the earliest pickup she could arrange was at least 2 hours away. Yuna tugged at his sleeve and asked if they were going to be okay. Dae-young looked down at his niece, at the trust in her eyes despite everything she had been through, and he made her a promise that he intended to keep. He told her they were going to be just fine. They moved through the streets using cover whenever possible, and Dae-young guided Yuna with gentle hands that contrasted sharply with the weapon he kept ready for immediate use. Twice they had to hide while Veth patrols passed nearby, and once they witnessed a firefight between Terran and Dominion forces that ended with casualties on both sides. Yuna buried her face against her uncle's chest during the worst of it, and he shielded her eyes from sights that no child should ever see. They were less than a kilometer from the Terran perimeter when their luck ran out. A Veth ground unit spotted them crossing an open plaza, and soldiers began shouting orders as they moved to intercept. Dae-young pushed Yuna behind a fallen statue and told her to stay down no matter what happened. And then he turned to face the approaching enemies. He was outnumbered at least 8-1, and he knew that fighting would almost certainly end with his death. But he also knew that surrendering would mean Yuna going back into Veth custody, and he had promised his sister that he would bring her daughter home. The first shot came from his weapon, and it struck the lead Veth soldier in the shoulder. The return fire forced him into cover, and he traded shots with the enemy while praying that reinforcements would somehow arrive. But no reinforcements came, and his ammunition began to run low, and the Veth were methodically advancing on his position. Yuna screamed his name as a shot grazed his arm, and the pain that followed told him he was running out of time. He was preparing for a final desperate charge when a new sound cut through the chaos. The roar of a Veth command vehicle approaching at high speed. Dae-young expected the vehicle to reinforce the soldiers trying to kill him, but instead it slammed to a halt between his position and the enemy, and a familiar figure emerged from the hatch. Torvax stood atop the vehicle with a communication device in his upper hands, and he began broadcasting on all frequencies in a voice that carried authority despite its calm tone. He identified himself by name and rank, and he declared that the child belonged with her family. He declared that he had been wrong to treat her as a political asset, and he declared that the Veth Dominion had shamed itself by using a grieving orphan as an excuse for war. His words reached not just the soldiers in the plaza, but every ship in orbit, every command center on both sides, and every news outlet that was monitoring military communications. For a long moment, nobody moved. Veth soldiers looked at each other in confusion, uncertain how to respond to one of their own publicly denouncing their mission. The soldiers in orbit watched through their sensors as the fighting on the ground slowly, hesitantly, began to stop. Torvax continued speaking, and he talked about what he had observed during his weeks as Yuna's guardian. He talked about her drawings and her songs and her desperate hope that someone would come to take her home. He talked about the human capacity for love that transcended politics and borders and the differences between species, and he talked about how watching a human uncle cross the stars to save his niece had taught him more about what truly mattered than all his years of government service. The fighting did not stop everywhere at once, And there were those on both sides who wanted the war to continue regardless of what one Veth official said. But Torvax's broadcast had been heard by millions, and his words planted seeds of doubt in minds that had been certain of their righteousness. Terran reinforcements finally arrived, and they secured the plaza while medics rushed to treat Dae-Young's wounds. He refused to let go of Yuna's hand even as they loaded him onto a stretcher, and she walked beside him with tears streaming down her face. 3 days later, they were aboard a Terran medical ship heading for Earth, and Dae-Young was recovering in a bed while Yuna sat beside him drawing pictures. The diplomatic situation remained complicated, but Torvax's broadcast had shifted public opinion on both sides, and negotiations for a real ceasefire had begun. Yuna finished her drawing and held it up for her uncle to see, and he looked at the image she had created. It showed 2 figures, one large and one small, holding hands beneath a sky full of stars. She told him it was a picture of them going home. Dae-Young smiled through his pain and told her it was. Beautiful Yuna set down the drawing and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much loss for someone her age, and she spoke words that would soon spread across the galaxy. She said that he was not her real dad. Dae-Young felt his heart tighten, and he wondered if she was rejecting him despite everything they had been through. But then Yuna climbed carefully onto the bed beside him and curled up against his uninjured side. And she finished her thought. She said that he was not her real dad, but he came anyway, and that was what family meant. Dae-Young wrapped his arm around his niece and held her close, and he thought about his sister who had died in the cold void of space. He thought about the promise he had made to bring her daughter home, and he knew that Sora would have been proud of him. He thought about Torvax, the Veth official who had risked everything to do the right thing, and he hoped that someday there would be peace between their peoples. And he thought about the little girl in his arms who had lost everything but had somehow found the strength to keep hoping. 2 armies had clashed over her fate, and thousands had fought and bled and died in a war that never should have happened. But in the end, it was not weapons or tactics or political maneuvering that had saved her. It was love. The simple human love of a man for his sister's child, and the unexpected compassion of an alien who had learned to see her as a person rather than a prize. The ship carried them toward Earth, toward home, and Yuna fell asleep listening to her uncle's heartbeat while the stars wheeled slowly past the viewport. She dreamed of her parents, and in her dreams they were smiling. They were proud of her for being brave, and they were grateful that someone had come for her when she needed help the most. And somewhere across the vast distances of space, in a detention cell on a Veth station, Torvax received word that the child had reached safety. He smiled, which was something his species rarely did, and he knew that whatever punishment awaited him had been worth it. Some things mattered more than duty and orders, and they pride of nations. Some things mattered more than anything else in the universe. Family was one of those things, and love, it seemed, was another. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and Dae-Young kept his weapon trained on the Veth official while shielding Yuna with his body. He had faced enemies before, and he had killed when necessary, but something in the alien's posture made him hesitate. Torvax was not aiming at him, and his forearmed stance suggested uncertainty rather than aggression. Yuna peeked around her uncle's leg and saw the tall blue alien who had been her guardian for the past weeks, and she surprised everyone by speaking first. She asked Torvax if he was going to take her away again. The question hung in the air like smoke after a battle, and Torvax found himself unable to answer immediately. He thought about his orders and his duty and everything his culture had taught him about the superiority of Veth civilization. But he also thought about the drawings Yuna made every day, the ones she talked to as if her parents could hear her through the paper. He remembered how she sang songs in her sleep, melodies from a world she would never see. And he remembered how she had looked at him on that first day with eyes full of grief that he had not understood. Torvax lowered his weapon. Dae-Young watched the alien carefully, not yet willing to trust this apparent surrender. And he asked what game the Veth was playing. Torvax replied that he was not playing any game. And he admitted something that cost him more than the human could possibly understand. He admitted that he had been wrong. The words seemed to surprise Torvax as much as they surprised the young. And for a moment, the Veth official simply stood there as if discovering a new truth about himself. He explained that he had spent weeks observing Yuna and treating her as a political asset rather than a person. And he had followed orders without questioning whether those orders served any purpose beyond government pride. But watching her cry for her mother had awakened something in him, some capacity for empathy that his training had tried to suppress. She deserved to be with family, Torvax said, and he no longer cared what his superiors thought about it. Dae-Young slowly lowered his own weapon and asked the alien what he intended to do. Torvax told him about a service tunnel that ran beneath the facility and connected to the city's maintenance network. And he explained that Veth forces had not yet secured that route. He offered to show them the way and to delay any pursuit long enough for them to escape. Dae-Young asked why he would betray his own people, and Torvax considered the question carefully before answering. He said that he was not betraying his people, but rather refusing to participate in something that shamed them. He said that the Veth Dominion had fought humans for territory and resources and pride, but using a grieving child as a weapon was beneath any civilization that claimed to be honorable. Yuna tugged at her uncle's sleeve and asked if the blue man was going to help them. Dae-Young looked down at his niece and then back at Torvax, and he made a decision based more on instinct than logic. He told Yuna that yes, the blue man was going to help them. The three of them moved quickly through the facility's lower levels, and Torvax used his security clearance to bypass checkpoints that would have stopped Dae-Young cold. They could hear fighting above them as the building came under attack from multiple directions, and the floor shook periodically from explosions that seemed to be getting closer. Dae-Young contacted his team through his communication device and told them to abort and make for the extraction point. And one by one, his veterans confirmed that they had received the message. Torvax led them to a heavy door that opened onto a ladder descending into darkness. And he explained that the tunnel would take them to a junction about 2 kilometers from the combat zone. He told Dae-Young to head east once they reached the surface, where Terran forces had established a defensive perimeter. Dae-Young asked if Torvax was coming with them, and the alien shook his head. He explained that someone needed to stay behind and cover their escape. And he said that his security codes could delay pursuit for at least an hour if he played his role correctly. Besides, he added with what might have been a Veth attempt at humor, running away with humans would make it difficult to advocate for peace from within the Dominion. Yuna surprised everyone again by pulling away from her uncle and walking up to Torvax. She looked up at the tall alien who had been her cold and distant guardian, and she thanked him in a voice still hoarse from crying. Torvax bent down to her level, an uncomfortable position for his species, and he apologized to her. He apologized for not understanding what she needed and for treating her like a problem to be managed rather than a child to be comforted. He told her that humans had a capacity for connection that his people had always underestimated, and he told her that she had taught him something important about what truly mattered. Yuna asked if she would ever see him again. Torvax admitted that he did not know, but he said he hoped that when she grew up, there would be peace between their peoples, and perhaps they could meet as friends rather than as captor and prisoner. Dae-Young placed a hand on Yuna's shoulder and gently guided her toward the tunnel entrance, and he paused to offer Torvax a nod of respect that transcended the boundaries between their species. The Veth returned the gesture in his own formal style. And then Dae-Jung lifted Yuna onto his back and began to climb down into darkness. Torvax watched them disappear. And then he turned back toward the facility where alarms still screamed and guards still searched for a child who was no longer there. He walked calmly toward the command center, already composing the lies he would tell to buy time for the humans. He knew that his career would likely end tonight, and he knew that his superiors would view his actions as treason. But for the first time in his life, he felt certain that he had done the right thing above the colony. The battle continued to rage, and ships died in brilliant flashes that observers on the surface could see even through the clouds of smoke that drifted across the city. Commanders on both sides demanded updates and issued orders, and the machinery of war ground forward with unstoppable momentum. But in a dark tunnel beneath the chaos, a human soldier carried his niece toward safety, and both of them held on to hope that had seemed impossible just hours before. They did not know that the hardest part of their journey still lay ahead, and they did not know that armies would soon learn their names, but they knew they were together, and for now, that was enough. The incident that shattered the fragile peace began with a navigation error that would later be blamed on faulty sensors. Though the truth was far more complicated. Terran shuttle carrying humanitarian observers had entered a zone that Veth patrol ships considered restricted, and the warning shots that followed struck the shuttle's engine compartment. 3 humans died in the explosion that followed, and their names would become rallying cries for those who wanted war within hours. The careful formations of both fleets dissolved into chaos as ships maneuvered for advantage, and commanders demanded vengeance or restraint, depending on their temperaments. The first real exchange of weapons fire happened near the colony's second moon, and the Veth destroyer traded blows with 2 Terran frigates before all 3 vessels limped away with heavy damage. Ground forces that had been waiting in transports for weeks finally received orders to deploy, and landing craft began descending toward New Harmony's surface like metal rain. Dae-Jung watched the military traffic from his hotel window and knew that time had run out for peaceful solutions. He gathered the small team that had assembled in response to his calls. 5 veterans who had served with him in conflicts that the public had already forgotten. There was Sergeant Kwan, who had saved his life during the Battle of Proxima Station, and Corporal Vasquez, whose skill with demolitions was matched only by her loyalty. Private Chun had followed him through 3 campaigns without ever questioning an order. And Specialist Okonkwo could hack any security system ever designed. The 5th member of the team was a surprise volunteer, a Terran intelligence officer named Captain Silva, who had her own reasons for wanting to see Yuna rescued. They were not officially authorized for any operation, and if they were caught, their government would deny any knowledge of their actions. But they had all agreed that some things mattered more than official authorization. The team moved through streets that had become chaotic with fleeing civilians and military patrols, and they used the confusion to their advantage. Silva had obtained building layouts and security schedules through methods she refused to discuss, and she guided them toward the diplomatic quarter where Yuna was being held. Explosions echoed across the city as Veth and Terran forces clashed at key intersections, and the night sky flickered with the light of weapons fire both on the ground and in orbit above. Inside the government facility, alarms blared as staff members rushed to implement emergency protocols. Torvax received orders to evacuate the child to a Veth cruiser that was holding position just beyond the combat zone, and he moved quickly toward Yuna's room with a security detail at his back. But when he opened her door, he found the room empty. Yuna had heard the explosions and the screaming, and the sounds had triggered memories of the station disaster that had killed her parents. She had panicked and run, slipping past distracted guards while they focused on the larger crisis unfolding around them. Now she wandered the facility's lower levels, lost and terrified, looking for somewhere to hide from the monsters that seemed to follow her everywhere. Torvax ordered his security team to search the building, and he felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest as he joined the hunt for the missing child. He told himself it was concern for his mission, but some part of him knew that was not entirely true. He had watched Yuna through security monitors for weeks now, and he had observed her grief and her loneliness and her desperate attempts to hold on to memories of her parents. She was not like the humans he had been taught to see as enemies and competitors, and she was not the political asset his superiors described in their communications. She was just a child who had lost everything. Dae-young's team breached the facility's perimeter through a service entrance that Silva's intelligence had identified as a weak point, and they moved through the building with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had done this many times before. Quan took point while Vasquez covered their rear, and Chun and Okonkwo handled the security systems that tried to stop them. They encountered 3 Veth guards who were too surprised to react effectively, and the confrontations were brief and relatively bloodless. Dae-young did not want to kill anyone tonight if he could avoid it. He just wanted to find his niece and take her home. The team split up to cover more ground, and Dae-young found himself alone in a maze of storage rooms and maintenance corridors. He called Yuna's name softly, not wanting to attract attention from hostile forces, and he listened for any response. The 3rd storage room he checked contained industrial supplies and forgotten equipment, and at first he thought it was empty like the others. But then he heard a small sound, a muffled sob that came from behind a stack of shipping containers. He moved carefully toward the sound, and he found Yuna curled into a ball with her hands over her ears. She was crying and whispering for her mother, and she did not notice him until he knelt down beside her. Yuna looked up at him with eyes full of terror, and for a moment she did not recognize the man who had held her just days ago. She saw only another adult in a world that had become nothing but fear and loss. Dae-young did not grab her or try to force her to move, and he simply waited while she stared at him with those frightened eyes. He began to hum a melody, a lullaby that his mother had sung to him and his sister when they were children. The same lullaby that Sora had sung to Yuna every night before bed. Recognition dawned in Yuna's face like sunrise breaking over dark mountains, and she whispered a single word. She whispered uncle, and then she was in his arms, clinging to him with a strength that seemed impossible for such a small body. And he held her while she cried and told her that he had come to take her home. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and Dae-young pulled Yuna behind him as he raised his weapon toward the doorway. Torvax appeared in the entrance with his own weapon drawn, and the 2 men faced each other across a distance that could be measured in meters but felt like light years. Neither of them moved, and neither of them spoke, and the only sound was Yuna's ragged breathing as she pressed her face against her uncle's back. Torvax looked at the human soldier and the child he was protecting, and he saw something that his species had always dismissed as human weakness. He saw love, fierce and unconditional and willing to face any danger for the sake of someone precious. And in that moment, Torvax made a decision that would change everything. The transport ship touched down at New Harmony's main spaceport, just as dawn broke over the colony's eastern mountains, and Dae-young stepped onto foreign soil with a single bag over his shoulder and determination in his heart. He had expected difficulties, but the reality exceeded his worst expectations. The spaceport was crawling with both Terran and Veth security forces, and they watched each other with the careful attention of predators sharing the same hunting ground. Dae-young showed his identification to the human customs officer, who looked at his military credentials and frowned. The officer warned him that the colony was under heightened security protocols and that all visitors were being monitored by both governments. Dae-young thanked him and walked into the city. The capital of New Harmony had once been a shining example of cooperation between species. And its architecture blended human and Veth designs in ways that should have been beautiful, but now the streets felt tense. And Dae-young noticed that humans and Veth walked on opposite sides of the road. Avoiding eye contact with each other, he made his way to the Terran consulate and requested an immediate meeting with whoever was handling his niece's case. The diplomatic aide who finally agreed to see him was a tired woman named Consul Reyes, and she explained the situation in terms that made Dae-young's blood run cold. The Veth were refusing all requests for custody transfer, and they had cited 17 different legal precedents to justify keeping Yuna in their care. The Terran government had responded with legal challenges of their own, but the process would take months or even years to resolve. Dae-young asked where his niece was being held, and Consul Reyes hesitated before telling him that Yuna was in a Veth administrative facility in the diplomatic quarter. She warned him that attempting to visit without proper authorization would be considered a diplomatic incident, and she strongly advised him to let the legal process work. Dae-young looked at her with eyes that had seen combat and loss and things that haunted his dreams. And he asked her one simple question. He asked her how she would feel if it were her niece trapped in a foreign government's custody while bureaucrats argued about paperwork. Consul Reyes had no answer for that. Over the next 3 days, Dae-young navigated a maze of regulations and applications and denials, and each rejection only strengthened his resolve to find another way. He discovered that the treaty governing New Harmony contained provisions for family visitation rights in cases involving minors, and he began building a legal argument that even the Veth could not easily dismiss. His military training had taught him patience and strategy, and he applied both to this new battlefield with the same intensity he had once directed at enemies who wanted to kill him on the 4th day. He received notification that his request for supervised visitation had been approved. The facility where they were keeping Yuna was a converted government building surrounded by security fences and guarded by Veth soldiers, and Dae-young felt his chest tighten as he approached the main gate. A Veth officer checked his credentials 3 times before allowing him inside, and another officer escorted him through hallways that smelled of cleaning chemicals and recycled air. They brought him to a small room with a table and 2 chairs, and they told him he would have exactly 30 minutes with the child. Yuna entered the room with a Veth social worker holding her hand, and Dae-young felt his heart break at the sight of her. She was so small and so frightened, and her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for escape. She did not recognize him at first, and why would she when he had only visited twice in her life? Once when she was a baby and once when she was 3 years old. Dae-young knelt down so that he was at her eye level, and he spoke softly in Korean, the language his sister had always used at home. He told Yuna his name and explained that he was her mother's brother, and he watched her face for any sign of recognition. Yuna stared at him with suspicion and asked him to prove it. Dae-young reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph that he had carried with him across the stars, and he held it up for her to see. The image showed him and Sora as teenagers, standing together at their parents' home on Earth. And even though the photo was decades old, there was no mistaking the family resemblance. Yuna's eyes went wide, and she reached for the photograph with trembling hands. She stared at her mother's young face for a long moment, and then the tears came. They came in waves that shook her small body, and she cried out for her mother with a grief that no child should ever have to carry. Dae-young opened his arms, and Yuna threw herself into them without hesitation. He held her while she sobbed, and he whispered promises that he would not leave her, that he would take her home, that everything would be okay. The Veth guard shifted uncomfortably as they watched this display of human emotion, and the social worker checked her timepiece with obvious impatience after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all. The guards announced that the visit was over. Yuna clung to Dae-young's neck and screamed that she did not want to go. And it took 2 guards to pull her away from him. The sound of her crying as they dragged her from the room would haunt his nightmares for years to come. That night, Dae-young sat in his hotel room and stared at the wall. And he thought about all the people he had failed to save during his years of military service. He thought about the soldiers who had died under his command. And he thought about the civilians caught in crossfire. And he thought about his sister who had died in the cold vacuum of space. He would not add Yuna to that list. He activated his communications terminal and began contacting old friends. Veterans who now served in positions throughout the fleet. People who owed him favors or who simply shared his belief that some things mattered more than regulations. Meanwhile, in a secure conference room aboard a Veth Command ship in orbit, Torvax received new orders from Dominion High Command. The situation had escalated beyond local diplomatic concerns, and the highest levels of government had become involved. The child was now considered a matter of national pride, and the Dominion could not be seen backing down to human pressure. Torvax was informed that if peaceful resolution proved impossible, the military option was now authorized. He was told to prepare the child for potential evacuation to Dominion space, where she would be raised as a proper citizen of the Empire. Torvax accepted his orders without visible reaction. But something inside him stirred as he thought about the small human who cried herself to sleep. Each night, he had begun to notice things about her that confused him, such as the way she talked to her drawings or how she sang songs in a language he did not understand. She was not just a political asset. He realized with growing discomfort, she was a person above New Harmony. Both fleets received authorization to engage if provoked, and commanders on both sides began running combat simulations. While hoping they would never need to use them, the galaxy held its breath. And at the center of everything was a little girl who just wanted someone to love her. The station orbiting New Harmony had been home to thousands of families for nearly 2 decades, and among them lived the small family of Park Min-jun and his wife Sora, along with their 8-year-old daughter, Yuna had known nothing but the stars outside her window and the gentle hum of the station's life support systems. And she had grown up believing that the universe was a peaceful place where humans and aliens lived together without conflict. But on the morning that would change everything, the station's warning alarms began to scream. Min-jun grabbed his daughter and pulled her toward the emergency pods, while Sora ran beside them. And they could feel the entire structure shaking as something terrible happened in the engineering section. The explosion came without mercy, and it tore through the station's hull like a predator ripping through prey. And in the chaos that followed, Yuna found herself sealed inside an emergency pod that launched automatically into the void. She screamed for her parents as the pod's small window showed her the station breaking apart. And she watched in horror as fire and debris consumed everything she had ever known. When rescue ships finally arrived 3 hours later, they found only 17 survivors among the wreckage. And Yuna was the youngest of them all. The colony world of New Harmony existed under a complicated arrangement, and both the Terran Republic and the Veth Dominion claimed administrative rights over different sections of the planet and its orbital infrastructure. The treaty that governed this arrangement had been signed 15 years ago, after a brief but bloody war, and neither side had forgotten the lives lost during those dark months. When the authorities began sorting through the survivor records, they discovered that Yuna presented a unique problem. She had been born on the station during a period when Veth administrators controlled that section, which meant the Dominion claimed she was technically their citizen by location of birth. But her parents had been Earthborn humans with full Terran citizenship, which meant the Republic argued she belonged to them by blood and heritage. Neither government was willing to yield. The Veth Dominion saw an opportunity to establish a legal precedent that would strengthen their claims over the colony. And the Terran Republic saw a challenge they could not afford. To lose Yuna understood none of this. She only knew that strange adults kept asking her questions and that nobody would tell her when she could see her parents again. A Veth official named Torvax was assigned as her temporary guardian while the legal disputes worked through diplomatic channels. And he arrived at the refugee center with the cold efficiency his species was known for. The Veth were tall beings with pale blue skin and 4 arms, and their faces showed little emotion that humans could easily read. Torvax looked down at Yuna with eyes that held no warmth, and he informed her that she would be staying in a government facility until her situation was resolved. Yuna asked him about her mother and father, and Torvax paused for a moment before telling her the truth in the blunt manner of his people. Her parents had not survived. The child's scream of grief echoed through the refugee center, and Torvax stood there uncertain of what to do as this small human creature collapsed into sobs that shook her entire body. He had not been trained for this, and emotions were something his culture considered private matters best handled in solitude. He simply waited until she exhausted herself, and then he led her to a transport vehicle that would take them to the secure facility. The building where Yuna would spend the next several weeks was clean and well-maintained, but it felt nothing like home, and she wandered its empty hallways like a ghost who had forgotten how to pass on. Torvax checked on her once each day, and he made sure she had food and clothing and educational materials. But he never once asked how she was feeling or offered any comfort to him. She was an assignment, a political asset that needed to be kept in good condition across the stars. On a Terran military station 3 systems away, a message arrived that would set everything in motion. Sergeant Major Park Dae-Young was reviewing equipment manifests when his commanding officer called him into a private office, and the look on the colonel's face told him something terrible had happened. The colonel explained about the station disaster, about his sister Sora and her husband Minjin, and about the little niece he'd only met twice in her short life. Dae-Young sat in silence as the words washed over him, and he felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. But when the colonel told him about the custody dispute and how the Veth were refusing to release Yuna to human authorities, that cold feeling transformed into something else entirely. It became fire. Dae-Young requested immediate leave, and when his request was denied due to rising tensions in the sector, he requested it again with a formal appeal that cited emergency family circumstances. The appeal process would take weeks, but Dae-Young was not a patient man when it came to family. He began reaching out to old friends who now served in various positions throughout the fleet, and he started gathering information about New Harmony and its current political situation. What he learned worried him deeply. Both governments had been moving military assets toward the colony for the past several days, and the diplomatic communications between them had grown increasingly hostile. The admirals and generals were using words like unacceptable and sovereignty and prepared to defend, and all of these words pointed toward a future that terrified anyone who remembered the last war. Yuna had become a symbol without even knowing it, and powerful people were making decisions about her fate based on politics rather than her well-being. In her room at the government facility, Yuna drew pictures of her parents with crayons that a staff member had given her, and she talked to the drawings as if they could hear her. She asked them why they had left her alone, and she asked them when they were coming back, and she asked them why the tall blue alien never smiled at her. Torvax observed her through the security monitors, and he noted in his reports that the human child exhibited signs of emotional distress that were within expected parameters for her situation. He did not understand that his clinical observations missed everything that mattered about what was happening to her above the colony. Warships from both civilizations drifted in careful formations, and their crews watched each other through sensors and scanners. While waiting for orders that everyone hoped would never come, the commanders on both sides had served in the previous war, and they knew exactly what would happen if those orders arrived. But knowing the cost of war had never been enough to prevent one. As the sun set on New Harmony's capital city, casting long shadows across the government facility where Yuna slept, a Terran transport ship entered the system carrying a determined uncle who had finally received his leave approval. Di-Young stood at the viewport and watched the planet grow larger, and he made a silent promise to his dead sister that he would bring her daughter home. He did not know that his arrival would be the spark that ignited something neither side could control. And he did not know that two armies would soon clash over the fate of one small girl who just wanted her family back. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not leaving without Yuna.